The clink of crystal and the hum of polite conversation filled the rooftop terrace, but all I could hear was the pounding in my ears. My graduation party was supposed to be a celebration of everything I'd fought to achieve. 4 years of late nights, endless labs, and standing my ground against a family who wanted to control every aspect of my life. Instead, it became the moment I realized just how far my parents were willing to go to keep me in their grip. I had just turned toward the champagne fountain when my gaze locked on something I couldn't unsee. My father, Joseph Harris, leaning ever so slightly over a tall, slender glass, tipping a tiny packet of white powder into it. He moved like a man tying his shoelaces. Casual, practiced, nothing to draw attention. But I saw it. I saw the powder swirling into the golden liquid, tiny particles catching the light for just a second before dissolving into nothingness. A slow chill crept up my spine, coiling around my ribs until it was hard to breathe. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a joke. This was deliberate. My father was trying to poison me, Dot. The reality of it slammed into me in 2 distinct waves. First, the shock that any parent could even imagine doing such a thing, and second, the dark, unsurprised recognition that if any parents could, it might be mine. The Harrises were many things: powerful, image-conscious, wealthy beyond measure. Loving, however, had never been one of them. Dot around me. The party continued as if nothing had happened. Strings from a live quartet swirled through the air. Waiters in pressed white jackets glided between clusters of guests, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres worth more than my monthly rent. From the outside, it was perfect, a glittering, enviable event, all in my honor. On the inside, it was a stage for a performance my parents had been perfecting for decades. I forced myself to move. 15 minutes, he'd said earlier when he clinked his glass to gather attention. 15 minutes until the champagne toast. That meant 15 minutes until he'd expect me to drink from that glass in front of everyone. The timing wasn't accidental. In a crowd this size, any sudden sickness could be blamed on the food, the heat, or a dozen other plausible causes. People might cluck their tongues and talk about how unfortunate it was that the guest of honor had fallen ill. But no one would suspect the smiling, generous parents who had thrown such an extravagant celebration. The orchestra shifted to a livelier number, and I felt the clock start ticking in my veins. 15 minutes. 15 minutes to decide how to handle a situation that could end with me in the hospital, or worse. My hands were steady, but only because I'd learned over the years how to mask fear when my parents were watching. Inside, my heart was slamming against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I drifted toward Taylor and our other close friend Zoe, weaving between guests and murmured congratulations. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father notice and subtly change his position to keep me in view. "I need you to do something for me," I said to Taylor quietly when I reached them, my smile never faltering. "No questions, not yet. Just record the toast. Get my father in frame and make sure you catch him handing me the champagne. Can you do that?" Taylor frowned but didn't hesitate. "Of course, but what's—" "Later," I cut in gently. "Just trust me." Zoe glanced between us, sensing the tension. "Is everything okay?" I forced a laugh. "Family drama. You know how it is." But this wasn't drama. This was survival. And as the minutes ticked down toward that toast, I knew one thing for certain. If my father wanted me to drink from that glass, I was going to make sure that glass told the real story. But behind those closed doors, the warmth and affection you might expect in a family home were replaced with scrutiny, coldness, and a constant measuring of worth. My parents didn't yell. Not often. They didn't have to. Disappointment was their most effective weapon. And while I was always enough for myself, I was never enough for them. Part of that had to do with my older sister, Mary. She was the prototype, the perfect Harris daughter. 3 years older than me, she hit every mark they set for her. Straight A's, debate team captain, Harvard Business School with honors. She joined the family company without hesitation, sliding into the role of heir apparent so smoothly it was like she'd been rehearsing for it her whole life. Our parents never missed her tennis matches or piano recitals. Her trophies were displayed in the main hallway, bathed in soft lighting like artifacts in a gallery. When she spoke at dinner, they listened attentively, nodding along as if each word was a pearl of wisdom. My experience was a different story. I was also a straight A student, but my achievements were treated like the bare minimum. "That's what we expect from a Harris," my father would say without looking up from his newspaper. When I won the state science fair in 10th grade, my mother didn't mention my project. She just noted that my hair looked messy in the photos. The contrast between us wasn't just about personality or accomplishments. It was about compliance. Mary followed the path they'd drawn. I wanted to draw my own dot from childhood. My parents had mapped out my future: study pharmaceutical sciences, join the family business, and eventually run the research division while Mary managed the corporate side. The idea of me having my own interests, my own goals, simply didn't fit into their blueprint. I discovered environmental science in high school, falling in love with the two. What I didn't know at the time was that I had an ally in all of this, one I'd already lost. My maternal grandmother, Lillian, had passed away when I was 16. She'd been a brilliant chemist herself, but her career had been overshadowed by her husband's. Out of everyone in the family, she was the only one who encouraged me to follow my curiosity wherever it led. Before she died, she made me promise not to let anyone dictate my future. I would learn later that she'd done more than give me advice. She'd left me a significant inheritance, locked in a trust that would become mine when I graduated or turned 23, whichever came last. That trust was the silent fuse ticking away beneath my parents' plans for me. And when they found out about it months before my graduation, it would become the match that lit everything on fire. The fight over my future had been simmering for years, but it truly ignited the day my parents discovered the existence of my trust fund. For most of my life, I thought my grandmother Lillian had simply been my biggest cheerleader, a warm, intelligent woman who smelled faintly of lavender and ink, who always asked what I was working on and actually listened to my answers. What I didn't know until much later was that she had also been quietly protecting me in ways that went far beyond kind words. The trust she left behind was no ordinary inheritance. It was ironclad, designed with independent trustees and strict terms. I wouldn't see a cent until I turned 23 or graduated from college, whichever came later. And once I met that requirement, the funds would transfer to me in full, with no oversight from my parents. The total? Roughly $12 million. It was enough to make me completely financially independent for life. It was also enough to make me a problem for my parents. The discovery came 3 months before my graduation, and in the most mundane way possible, during a company meeting. My parents' attorney, a man named Gerald Thorne, had let the information slip while reviewing some estate documents. According to my sister Mary, who later told me the story, my father's face drained of color in an instant. My mother covered the reaction with a tight smile, but Mary could feel the tension radiating from both of them. Up until that moment, my parents' control over me had always been tethered to financial dependency. If I wanted something, tuition, rent, even new equipment for my research, I had to go through them. That leverage was about to vanish. And for people like Joseph and Eleanor Harris, losing control wasn't an option. The timing could not have been worse for them. Harris Pharmaceuticals had been under growing internal strain. Rumors swirled about irregularities in clinical trials. My father had been spending more and more time behind closed doors with senior executives, and my mother's social events had become more pointed, more about networking with allies than hosting for pleasure. And then there was me. The daughter they saw as unpredictable, independent-minded, and, worst of all, principled. In their eyes, I had every reason to take that inheritance and distance myself from them forever. Worse still, I had both the scientific knowledge and the stubbornness to expose any wrongdoing I came across. I didn't realize how sharply things had shifted until the pressure campaign stopped. My parents had been relentless for years about pushing me toward a role at the company. Job descriptions for research positions appeared in my inbox weekly. Thinly veiled lectures about family duty dropped into every conversation. Suddenly, that all vanished. In its place came niceness. Polite texts, invitations to lunch, questions about my graduation plans that didn't immediately segue into offers from Harris Pharmaceuticals. For most people, that would have been a relief. For me, it was suspicious. My parents didn't back off unless they were maneuvering for something. Meanwhile, my own path was coming into focus. I'd been working closely with an environmental nonprofit on a proposal to address pharmaceutical waste contamination in waterways. The deeper I dug, the more I understood just how much damage unregulated disposal could cause, and how often companies skirted responsibility. My father's company had always claimed to be environmentally conscious. The data I'd seen in industry reports told a different story. Graduation day was the light at the end of a very long tunnel. 4 years of balancing a double focus, keeping my GPA near perfect while navigating my parents' constant pressure, had left me exhausted but determined. I wanted my degree, my independence, and my future free from the Harris shadow. That morning, as I adjusted my cap and gown in my apartment mirror, I felt a strange mix of pride and apprehension. I had no idea that by the end of the day, that apprehension would turn into something much darker. The text from my mother came at 9:15 a.m. Car service will pick you up at 9:30. Don't be late. Not a word of congratulations. No, we're proud of you. Just logistics. When I arrived at the auditorium, my father was glued to his phone, scanning emails as if he were closing a deal instead of watching his youngest daughter graduate. My mother greeted me with a critique of my hair, reminding me there would be a photographer later. Mary gave me a small, private smile, one of the few gestures from her I could still interpret as genuine. Taylor and Zoe found me a few minutes later, pulling me into a tight hug. They'd been my lifeline through rough college, the people who reminded me I was more than just a Harris, who showed me what family could look like when it wasn't transactional. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my parents step away for what looked like an intense conversation. I couldn't hear most of it, but one fragment floated over the crowd. My father's voice, low and sharp. We need to solve this problem today before it gets out of hand. When my mother caught me watching them, she pasted on her best social smile and ushered me toward our seats. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Speeches, applause, the satisfying weight of my diploma. But when the car service whisked us to the Peninsula Chicago afterward, I realized just how much my parents had invested in making this night memorable. They had rented the entire rooftop terrace. There were ice sculptures, an orchestra, champagne fountains, and guests I barely knew. It was over the top even by Harris standards, and it didn't feel like it was for me at all. It felt like a stage, and I was beginning to suspect I wasn't meant to make it to the final act. The Harris household had never been a warm one, but after my parents learned about the trust fund, the atmosphere shifted from cold to calculated. For as long as I could remember, my parents' influence over me had been reinforced by financial control. Every opportunity, every decision, even something as small as a new lab textbook, passed through their silent approval process. The trust shattered that. In one legal clause, my grandmother had handed me something my parents couldn't touch: autonomy. It was the kind of autonomy that could put me beyond their reach permanently. I wouldn't need their approval. I wouldn't need their money. I wouldn't have to tolerate their disapproval. To them, that was the same as betrayal. Mary told me later that the day our attorney mentioned the trust, she saw something rare in our father's face: fear. My mother, ever the performer, masked it with her usual social smile, but Mary felt her grip tighten on the arm of her chair. Neither of them said anything about it to me at first, but the tension was palpable, like the moment before a glass shatters. The change in their behavior was subtle at first. They stopped bringing up job openings at Harris Pharmaceuticals. The pointed remarks about my environmental science phase vanished. Even the passive-aggressive digs at holiday dinners dried up. On the surface, it might have looked like progress, a family finally learning to respect boundaries. But I knew better. In our family, silence was never a sign of peace. It was a sign of strategy. Instead of criticism, there were invitations. Let's have lunch next week. Why don't you join us for the gala? My mother called to ask about my graduation plans, offering to throw a proper celebration befitting a Harris. My father even asked about my research project, something he'd previously dismissed as a waste of my potential. It was unnerving, like watching predators lower themselves into a crouch before they pounce. At the same time, other things were happening in the background, things I didn't fully understand yet. Dr. Lewis, one of my professors and a former research partner of my father's, pulled me aside one afternoon. "Be careful," he warned in a low voice. "Your parents seem particularly invested in the family image right now, and there are rumors, irregularities in the company's clinical trials. If the wrong people start digging—" He trailed off, leaving the rest unspoken. I didn't press him for details then, but his concern lodged itself in my mind. Combined with my parents' sudden niceness, it created an uneasy tension I couldn't shake. Then graduation day arrived. The morning was bright and crisp, but my stomach churned with nerves. I'd worked too hard to get here to let their presence ruin it, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something was building beneath the surface. The car service arrived right on schedule. My father barely looked up from his phone when I joined them outside the auditorium. My mother's greeting was a critique of my hair, as if my appearance was the only thing that mattered on one of the most important days of my life. Mary stood slightly apart, giving me that small, almost apologetic smile I'd seen her wear at other tense family moments. Taylor and Zoe arrived minutes later, pulling me into hugs and chatter. Their joy was a lifeline in the sea of controlled smiles and polite detachment. That's when I caught my parents in the corner of my vision, speaking quietly but intensely. My father's words floated across the space between us. "We need to solve this problem today, before it gets out of hand." My mother's face was drawn tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. When she noticed me watching, she switched on her practiced social smile and ushered me toward the auditorium doors. The ceremony passed in a blur. The speeches, the applause, the moment my name was called. I scanned the audience for their reaction. Mary clapped politely, my friends cheered, and my parents' expressions remained unreadable. Afterward, the car service took us to the Peninsula Chicago. The moment I stepped onto the rooftop terrace, I froze. It was extravagant even by their standards. Ice sculptures glittering in the afternoon light, champagne fountains bubbling beside gourmet food stations, fresh flowers on every table. A string quartet played softly in the background. Guests milled around in designer clothing, many of them strangers to me. "This is a lot," I murmured to Dr. Lewis when he appeared beside. "To me, quite the production," he agreed, handing me a glass of water. "But half these people aren't here for you, they're here for them." He nodded discreetly toward my father, who was deep in conversation with two men in expensive suits. "Business associates. And over there with your mother, that's Gerald Thorne." His voice dropped. "If the FDA investigation gains traction, your father will need every ally he can get." That word, investigation, made my skin prickle. I was about to ask more when I noticed something else. My parents watching me. Not with pride or even the familiar undertone of disappointment, but with a strange, calculating intensity. Every time I moved to another group of guests, one of them repositioned to keep me in sight. Mary drifted over at one point, leaning close so no one else could hear. "Something weird is going on," she murmured. "Dad's asked me 3 times if you've said anything about your post-graduation plans. Mom keeps checking her watch like she's waiting for something." Before I could respond, my father clinked his glass, calling for attention. His smile was wide, but his eyes stayed cold. "In 15 minutes, he announced, "we'll have a special champagne toast to the graduate. Make sure you all have a glass for the occasion." 15 minutes. That's when I realized whatever was coming, it was scheduled. And I was the target. 15 minutes. That was all the time I had between my father's announcement and whatever he'd planned for that toast. The first thing I did was get away from the crowd. I excused myself, telling Mary I needed the restroom, but instead of heading for the main facilities, where a line of guests was already forming, I slipped down a quieter service corridor I'd noticed earlier. My plan was simple: buy a few minutes to think. That's when I heard them. Their voices carried just enough to stop me mid-step around. In the corner, tucked in a narrow alcove, my parents were arguing. Not in the clipped, passive-aggressive way they usually fought, but with urgency, their voices low but sharp. "Are you absolutely certain this is necessary?" My mother's voice was tight, edged with something I didn't often hear from her. Fear. "Do you want to lose everything we've built?" My father hissed back. "The FDA investigation is gaining momentum. If they find those test results, we're finished. And that trust gives her enough money to be completely independent. What if she decides to play environmental crusader and exposes the river contamination from the West facility? She's self-righteous enough to do it." My blood went cold. My mother tried again. "But drugging her at her own graduation party, it's just enough to make her sick." My father cut in, impatient. "Not to kill her. She'll be hospitalized for a few days with what looks like food poisoning. That gives us time to move assets before the trust disperses. The lawyers confirmed if she dies before the official transfer next week, it reverts to us." "Keep your voice down," my mother snapped. "Someone could hear us." I flattened myself against the wall, my pulse roaring in my ears. The words, "not to kill her," should have been comforting, but they weren't. My father was a master manipulator. If the compound in that champagne could be lethal, would he tell my mother? Or was this reassurance just part of managing her, the same way he managed everyone else? The biochemist in me started analyzing automatically. It would need to be a compound that mimicked natural illness, something hard to detect on a standard toxicology screen, probably derived from research in Harris Pharmaceuticals' own labs. Nausea and vomiting would likely be the first signs, dizziness, maybe cardiovascular effects depending on the dose. If I could identify the symptoms quickly, I might be able to tell doctors exactly what to test for. But none of that mattered if I couldn't survive the toast. I slipped back toward the main corridor before they could spot me, pausing at a mirror to steady my hands and check my face. Years of living with them had taught me how to compartmentalize. But this was beyond anything I'd ever imagined. When I returned to the rooftop, the waitstaff was already preparing champagne flutes on silver trays. My father stood over one particular tray like a hawk, pointing out a bottle with a gold label to the head waiter. I caught the words, "For the family only." My stomach twisted. This was it. I made my way to Taylor and Zoe, lowering my voice so no one else could hear. "I need you to do something for me. No questions asked," I whispered. "Taylor, so record the toast. Get my father in frame when he hands out the champagne. Zoe, stay close to me." Taylor didn't hesitate. Zoe's eyes narrowed with concern, but she nodded. Minutes ticked by like hours. Guests were gathering, glasses in hand. The late afternoon light caught the bubbles rising in each flute. The gold label bottle was opened, and my father personally poured several glasses, setting one slightly apart from the others. When he turned toward me, everything slowed. His face was the picture of a proud father, to anyone else. But I saw the steel behind the smile. The glint of his signet ring caught the light as he held the glass out to me. "To Mary," he said loudly, "may your future be everything you deserve." I looked down at the glass. There it was, a faint cloudiness at the bottom where the powder hadn't fully dissolved. My heart thudded once, hard, and then a strange calm settled over me. I couldn't refuse it. Not here. Not in front of everyone. If I did, they'd find another way. I needed proof. I needed the act itself on record. Then, without really thinking, I made my move. "Speaking of my amazing sister," I said brightly, stepping toward Mary, "I wouldn't be here without her support." I held the champagne out to her. "This special reserve is too good not to share. Take mine." Before anyone could react, I'd swapped glasses with her, taking her partially drunk one in exchange. My father's smile froze, just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. My mother's knuckles whitened around her own glass. Mary looked momentarily confused, but years of social training kicked in. She raised the glass. "To family," she echoed, and took a deep drink. I sipped from her original glass, never breaking eye contact with my father. His face had gone ashen, a fine sheen of sweat appearing along his hairline. My mother's eyes darted between us, her mask cracking at the edges. The moment passed. Guests applauded, conversation resumed, and the quartet struck up another piece. But my pulse was still pounding in my ears. I told myself the dose was supposed to be non-lethal, that I'd overheard my father say it was only meant to make me sick. But what if that was a lie? What if Mary reacted badly? What if I just condemned my sister? 34 minutes later, I had my answer. Across the terrace, Mary pressed a hand to her forehead, her expression dazed. "I feel strange," I heard her say, her voice slurring. She swayed on her feet and then her knees buckled. A nearby guest caught her just before she hit the ground. "Help!" someone shouted. "Something's wrong!" I was already moving, pushing through the crowd as my parents rushed in from the other side. The panic on their faces was raw, but it wasn't for me. It was for their golden child. And in that moment, I knew the next few hours would decide everything. Mary's collapse hit the rooftop like a thunderclap. One moment, polite conversation and clinking glasses. The next, a sharp gasp cutting through the air, followed by the sickening sight of her knees buckling. She was caught awkwardly by a young associate from the firm, but her body sagged in his arms. "She just went dizzy," he stammered, panic written all over his face. 1 second, she was fine. My parents were there in seconds. My father dropped to his knees beside her, his hand cradling her head, while my mother's voice rose to a near shriek. "Call an ambulance, now!" All traces of composure were gone. I pushed through the tightening ring of guests, my eyes darting over Mary Pale, sweat-slicked skin. Her pupils looked dilated, her breathing quick but shallow. She mumbled incoherently, her words slipping past in a jumble that made no sense. Dr. Lewis appeared at my side, already loosening the collar of her dress. "Heart rate's elevated and irregular," he muttered, checking her pulse. "We need medical personnel now." The orchestra had gone silent. Somewhere behind me, I heard a voice say, "Paramedics are 5 minutes out." That was my window. The only time I'd have before this spiraled into another carefully controlled Harris cover-up. I knelt down, my voice level even though my insides were twisting. "Stay with her," I told my parents. "I'll go downstairs to direct the paramedics." They barely registered my words, all attention fixed on Mary. My father was muttering to her, a low stream of reassurances that somehow managed to sound like instructions. My mother kept dabbing at her forehead with a linen napkin, her hands trembling. As soon as I was in the elevator, I pulled out my phone and called Taylor. "Meet me in the lobby, bring your phone," the one with the video, "and send me a backup copy right now, it's an emergency." Taylor didn't ask questions. "On my way." The doors opened to reveal Taylor and Zoe pacing anxiously near the entrance. "She collapsed," I explained in a rush, moving toward the doors. "I think it's the champagne. When the paramedics arrive, give them the video. Tell them I suspect poisoning." Zoe's eyes widened. "Poisoning?" "Trust me," I said, pushing through the glass doors as sirens grew louder in the distance. "I'll explain later." The first ambulance pulled up moments later. 2 paramedics hopped out, hauling equipment. I stepped straight into their path. Upstairs, my sister's collapsed. Symptoms: dizziness, disorientation, irregular heartbeat, tremors. I have reason to believe she ingested a toxic substance about 30 minutes ago. One of them snapped his head toward me. "You suspect poisoning?" "Yes," I said, already moving to lead them inside. "I'm a biochemistry graduate. The onset and symptoms fit. Please run specific toxicology. I can suggest compounds to look for." Before I could elaborate, the elevator doors opened behind us and chaos spilled out. My parents emerged with Dr. Lewis, supporting a barely conscious Mary between them. She was trembling now, her lips parted in shallow breaths. "BP 90/60 and dropping," one paramedic called as they eased her onto the gurney. "Pulse 120 and irregular." My mother clung to the side rail, her voice cracking. "Please, please help her. She just collapsed." My father's eyes found mine over her prone body. Rage flickered there, and something else. Fear. "What did you do?" he demanded in a low, venomous voice. "Nothing," I said evenly. "She drank from my glass. You remember? The special champagne you poured just for me?" His jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jump. You switched them deliberately. You knew... Knew what? I asked softly, holding his gaze. That you put something in mine? Why would I think that, Father? Before he could answer, a paramedic interrupted. We need one family member in the ambulance. The rest can follow by car. I'm going, my mother said immediately, climbing in beside the gurney, my father's hand clamped around my arm, hard enough to bruise. We're all going. Now. The ride to Northwestern Memorial was silent except for the faint sound of tires on asphalt. My father drove with white-knuckled precision. I sat in the back, staring out the window while my phone buzzed in my lap. Taylor's text flashed. Video sent to your email shows you switching glasses after he handed you one. Her next message was even more important. What do I tell the police when they get here? Tell them everything. I typed back. Show them the video. At the hospital, Mary was rushed into a treatment area. My mother followed, sobbing to anyone who would listen about her precious daughter and the mystery of her sudden illness. I walked straight to the nurse's station. I need to speak to her doctor immediately. I have reason to believe she was poisoned, and I may know what it was. The nurse's eyebrows rose. Poisoned? Based on what? I'm a biochemistry graduate specializing in pharmaceutical compounds, I said. Please. Time might be critical. Minutes later, I was face to face with Dr. Patel, the attending physician. She explained quickly, your sister's presenting symptoms are consistent with anticholinergic poisoning, elevated heart rate, confusion, dilated pupils, dry mouth. Test for cyclopentolate derivatives, I told her immediately. Modified versions. My father has access to them at Harris Pharmaceuticals. They're in trials. They won't show up on standard screens. She gave me a sharp, assessing look. That's a very specific suggestion. Why? Because I believe my father put it in my champagne. My sister drank it instead. Her expression didn't change, but she reached for the phone. We'll need to contact the police. And just like that, the night shifted from a family crisis to a criminal investigation. It didn't take long for the hospital to transform into something that felt less like an ER and more like the opening scene of a crime drama, Wit-T. In an hour of Mary arrival, 2 detectives appeared, followed by a uniformed officer stationed outside her treatment room. Nurses moved briskly, whispering in corners. The air buzzed with a tension that was no longer just about her survival. It was about what and who had put her here. Detective Rivera was the first to introduce herself to me. She was a tall woman with kind eyes, but a voice that left no room for evasion. Walk me through what happened tonight, she said, pulling a small notebook from her jacket. So I did. I told her about seeing my father slip powder into my glass, about overhearing the conversation in the service corridor, about switching glasses with Mary. I explained what I'd overheard, the timing of the trust payout, the mention of the West facility contamination, the plan to hospitalize me just long enough to move assets before the transfer. Rivera's pen scratched steadily over the paper. And why would your parents want to harm you? Money, I said simply. Control. My grandmother left me a $12 million trust that activates next week. If I die before then, it reverts to my parents. They also suspect I might expose environmental contamination tied to Harris Pharmaceuticals. I've been working in environmental science. They know I'm capable of proving it. She underlined something in her notes. That's a serious accusation, Ms. Harris. I know, I said. I also have video evidence. I told her about Taylor recording the toast, how it showed my father handing me a specific glass, and the moment I switched it with Mary. You can also speak to Dr. Lewis, I added. He's known my family for years and can tell you about the tension and the company's history. Before Rivera could respond, Dr. Patel entered with a tablet in hand. We have preliminary toxicology results, she said. We found elevated levels of a modified anticholinergic compound, similar to, but not identical with, cyclopentolate. It's a research-grade drug not yet in commercial production. In English? Rivera asked. It's a lab-created substance that can mimic severe food poisoning, nausea, vomiting, dehydration, but with added cardiovascular effects, I explained. Exactly the kind of thing Harris Pharmaceuticals has been developing, and only someone with direct access to their research labs would have it. Rivera turned to Dr. Patel. Is her condition stable? She's serious, but stable, Patel said. We've started physostigmine as an antidote. If we hadn't identified the compound quickly, there could have been permanent heart damage. Relief washed over me so sharply, it was almost dizzying. But before I could say anything, Rivera's eyes fixed on me with a piercing steadiness. By your own admission, you knowingly let your sister drink from that glass. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what else to do. If I refused it, they'd try again another way. I needed proof. I thought it was just enough to make someone sick, not life-threatening. My voice cracked, but I forced myself to keep eye contact. It was a terrible decision. I'll have to live with it. The door burst open before she could reply. My father strode in, trailed by a flustered officer, and a man in an expensive suit I recognized instantly. Gerald Thorne, the family attorney. This is outrageous, my father barked. My daughter is clearly unstable and jealous of her sister's success. She's been making wild accusations for years. Mr. Harris, Rivera said evenly, I'll have to ask you to step outside. Joseph, don't say another word, Thorne cut in smoothly, resting a hand on my father's arm. Detective, my client will cooperate fully, but any further questions should come through me. You realize your client isn't under arrest yet, Rivera said, the emphasis on yet deliberate. We have video evidence of the toast in toxicology confirming a research compound in Mary Harris's system. For just a moment, my father's ears' composure cracked, his eyes narrowing in a way I knew too well. Then his voice softened into the measured tone he used for press conferences. Mary has always been troubled. She resented our expectations. We indulged her whims. We even threw this expensive party to support her. And this is how she repays us, by allowing her sister to become ill for some twisted drama. I didn't take my eyes off him. She drank from my glass, Father. You know that. Rivera ended the exchange, escorting both men out. Interesting family you have, she murmured on her way back. You have no idea, I said. Not long after, another figure appeared in the hallway. Dr. Lewis, arguing with the officer outside Mary room. I'm her family physician, he insisted. I need to review her treatment. Rivera and I stepped out just as Dr. Patel emerged from the room. She's asking for you, Mary, she said. She's still groggy, but lucid. Inside, Mary looked pale and fragile, her hair damp against her forehead. She blinked up at me. Is it true? She asked hoarsely. Did Dad really try to poison you? I nodded, my throat tightening. I'm so sorry you drank it instead. I just reacted. I didn't think. Her brow furrowed in confusion. Why would he do that? The trust, I said quietly, and the contamination at the West facility. They're afraid I'll expose it. Recognition flickered in her eyes. The sealed reports, the heavy metal readings. I saw them but didn't understand what I was looking at. Before I could respond, Rivera stepped back in with another officer. We've just been updated. The FBI has been investigating Harris Pharmaceuticals for the past 6 months for fraud, environmental violations, and falsifying clinical trial data. They've executed search warrants at your family's offices and home. The words landed with the weight of inevitability. For years, I'd known something about my parents was rotten at the core. Now the truth was finally catching up to them, and this time they wouldn't be able to buy their way out. The hours after the FBI revelation blurred into a haze of questions, paperwork, and snippets of overheard conversations between agents and detectives. The sterile hum of the hospital hallway was a stark contrast to the weight of what had just been confirmed. Our parents weren't just guilty of what happened at the rooftop terrace. They were part of something much bigger, uglier, and more dangerous. When the initial chaos settled, I found myself back in Mary's room. She was propped up in bed, an IV line running to her arm, the faint beeping of monitors tracking every heartbeat. Her face was pale, but her eyes had cleared enough for us to have a real conversation. You know, she said quietly, I used to think you exaggerated about them." The honesty in her tone made my chest tighten. "I know," I said. "I don't blame you. They treated you differently. You were their ideal, their shield. As long as you played your part, they could point to you and make me look like the rebellious one." Her gaze dropped to the blanket. "I defended them. Every time you complained, every time you pulled away, I told myself you were being dramatic." She swallowed hard. "But hearing them talk about you like that, watching them hover over that champagne, I'll never forget the look on Dad's face when you gave me your glass." I hesitated, the weight of my earlier choice pressing down on me. I thought it was non-lethal. I told myself I was just buying time, getting proof. But the truth is, I gambled. And I gambled with your life. Mary shook her head slowly. "You saved me. I didn't know it at the time, but you did. If it had been you on that gurney, they would have spun it, covered it, and made sure no one ever asked the right questions." We sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of everything stretching between us. When she spoke again, her voice was more certain. "Those sealed reports I mentioned, beyond the heavy metal contamination, they're real. I saw the readings, Mary. They've been dumping research waste straight into the watershed for years. Whole communities are downstream from that." I felt a cold, focused anger take root. And they think I'd expose them, which means they know exactly how damning the evidence is. Mary's next words were almost a whisper. "I want to help." For a second, I just looked at her. This was Mary, the sister who'd followed every rule, lived every expectation, worn the crown of the perfect Harris. Now she was offering to stand against them. "You're still their heir," I said cautiously. "You've signed documents. They'll try to pull you down with them." "I don't care," she said, her jaw tightening. "If it means telling the truth, I'll sign whatever I need to and talk to whoever will listen. I'm done protecting them." It wasn't just words. I could see it in her expression, the same stubbornness I'd always carried finally surfacing in her. We were different in so many ways, but in that moment, I recognized a version of myself in her for the first time. The next few days became a crash course in cooperation with law enforcement. Detective Rivera arranged for Mary to give a full statement once she was stable enough, detailing every internal document she'd seen, every conversation she'd had with executives about regulatory adjustments or expedited approvals. The FBI agents were methodical, moving between the hospital and their temporary field office with files, laptops, and evidence bags. They confirmed what Mary had seen: years of falsified safety reports, manipulated clinical trial data, and systematic environmental violations. One agent even showed me a sample of the compound found in Mary's system. "This came directly from your father's private research lab," he explained. "We have a log showing he signed it out 3 days before your graduation." Every piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of Harris Pharmaceuticals and of Joseph and Eleanor Harris. Through it all, Mary and I kept talking. Some of those conversations were about logistics, which lawyers to hire, how to protect ourselves legally, how to prepare for the media fallout. But many were about us. "I used to think you enjoyed being the problem," she admitted one night, her voice tinged with shame, "that you wanted to make things harder for them just for the sake of it." "I wanted to make things harder for them when what they were doing was wrong," I corrected gently. "But I never wanted to make things harder for you." Her eyes softened. "You've been alone in this for a long time, haven't you?" "Long enough to stop expecting anyone to believe me," I said. "But I'm glad that's not true anymore." By the time Mary was discharged into the care of our Aunt Patricia, one of the few relatives who had ever been openly critical of my parents, we had agreed on 2 things. We were going to distance ourselves legally and financially from Joseph and Eleanor, and we were going to help the authorities expose everything we could about the company's crimes. For years, I had seen Mary as an extension of them, polished, compliant, untouchable. Now, I was beginning to see her as something else entirely, a survivor, like me, and as strange as it felt, we were about to fight the same battle, side by side. The courthouse was already swarming with reporters when Mary and I arrived for our parents' preliminary hearing. Flashes from cameras stung my eyes as microphones were thrust toward us, voices shouting questions over one another. Mary, did you really switch glasses with your sister? Mary, do you believe your sister tried to harm you? Do either of you think your parents are capable of attempted murder? We kept moving, not answering. The air crisp when the early morning tension. Mary's hand brushed mine briefly, a silent reminder that whatever happened inside, we were walking in together. Inside, the hearing room was packed. The front row of the gallery was filled with journalists, pens poised. Across the aisle, our parents sat at the defense table. Even after weeks in detention, they were immaculate. Tailored suits, perfect hair, a faint trace of cologne that still made my stomach turn. My mother's eyes welled when she saw Mary, her lips trembling as if she might speak. My father didn't look at either of us. He sat perfectly still, jaw tight, eyes fixed forward. When the prosecution began, they wasted no time. They played the video Taylor had taken. The toast, my father handing me the specific glass, the moment I switched it with Mary. The grainy footage caught the flicker of shock on his face, my mother's whitened knuckles around her glass. Then came the toxicology reports. The compound in Mary's system matched exactly to a sample seized from my father's private lab. Chain of custody records proved he had checked it out just days before the party. Financial records followed. The trust terms were displayed on a screen for the judge. If I died before the transfer, the funds reverted to my parents. A clear financial motive, the prosecutor said. The most shocking moment, though, was the audio recording, a phone call my father had made from detention. His voice filled the courtroom. Clean up the situation with those river samples. Mary's always been the problem child, never understood family loyalty. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. My father's face remained expressionless, but his fingers drummed once on the table before stilling again. The defense tried to paint me as unstable, claiming I'd staged the glass switch to frame my father and gain sympathy. They pointed to my history of defying the family, of pursuing a career outside Harris Pharmaceuticals, of publicly criticizing corporate environmental practices. But each accusation only strengthened my resolve. I sat up straighter, refusing to let my parents' narrative define me. When the judge finally ruled, there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial on all counts. Including attempted murder, my mother collapsed into dramatic sobs. My father's only visible reaction was the tightening of his jaw. Outside, the reporters descended again. This time, Mary surprised me. She stopped, turned toward the crowd, and raised her voice. "My sister saved my life," she said, her tone clear and unwavering. Our parents tried to poison her. When she realized it, she had seconds to decide what to do. She's carried unnecessary guilt for what happened to me, but the only people responsible are Joseph and Eleanor Harris. They were willing to kill their own daughter for money and to cover up their crimes. That is the story you should be telling. The effect was immediate. The crush of questions quieted for a beat as photographers snapped furiously. It was the first time Mary had spoken publicly against our parents, and she'd done it without hesitation. We moved toward the waiting car, but the cameras followed us like shadows. Mary kept her chin high, the image of the perfect Harris daughter now rewritten as the woman who'd turned her back on everything that name had once promised. In the days that followed, her statement to the press became a turning point. People who had once dismissed me as the rebellious, bitter younger daughter now saw us as united. Two women betrayed by the same parents, determined to tell the truth. More relatives came forward, some with their own stories of being pushed out or silenced by the Harris machine. Even my father's estranged brother reached out, reminding us that the family's history of control and retaliation went back decades. For the first time, I felt the tide shifting, not just in the legal battle, but in the narrative that had surrounded me my whole life. The problem child was no longer alone, and my parents, for all their power and influence, were facing something they couldn't buy, threaten, or spin away: the truth, spoken out loud in public by both of their daughters. In the weeks after the preliminary hearing, life shifted into a strange new rhythm. a mix of legal strategy meetings, media inquiries, and the slow work of dismantling our ties to the Harris empire. The first step was legal separation. Our attorney, Vivian Santos, was sharp, calm, and disarmingly empathetic, a rare combination in the world we'd grown up in. She walked us through the steps to ensure neither of us could be linked financially or professionally to Joseph or Eleanor Harris ever again. "You're both named in multiple trusts and corporate structures," she explained during our first meeting. "We'll need to formally decline certain assets to avoid any claim that you're benefiting from their holdings." "I don't want a single cent connected to them," I said immediately. Mary nodded. "Me neither. But what about the employees who weren't involved in any of this? If the company collapses—" Vivian leaned back, steepling her fingers. "That's a separate battle. But if you want to protect them, there are ways. We can push for certain assets to be directed toward restructuring instead of liquidation." That became part of our focus. We worked with investigators to identify executives and staff who had been complicit in the crimes while advocating for those who hadn't. It was a strange feeling, to fight for the survival of a company that had been the backdrop for so much harm, not because we loved it, but because we knew innocent people's livelihoods hung in the balance. Meanwhile, the trust my grandmother had left me was transferred in full. The trustees, moved by the extraordinary circumstances, accelerated the process. For the first time in my life, I had complete financial independence. I put part of it into a dedicated fund for Mary's ongoing medical care and therapy. The rest, I began investing into something that felt like the opposite of my parents' legacy, a foundation focused on environmental remediation, specifically targeting pharmaceutical waste. Mary, for her part, resigned from Harris Pharmaceuticals immediately after leaving the hospital. She spent months meeting with prosecutors, walking them through the company's operations and pointing out where records had been altered. The more she saw, the angrier she became. "They built everything on lies," she said one night over coffee in my apartment. "Not just the environmental stuff. They falsified trial data for drugs that are on the market right now. People could have died because of them." "They did," I said quietly. "The lawsuits will prove it." By late summer, we'd both settled into a new phase, one where our energy was spent not on defending ourselves from our parents, but on actively repairing the damage they'd done. I accepted a position with an environmental remediation firm that specialized in industrial contamination. My first major project? The cleanup of the Harris West facility site. There was something cathartic about it, to take the very knowledge my father had tried to use as a weapon against me and turn it into a tool for restoration. Mary, inspired by the prosecutors and victim advocates she'd met, applied to law school with the intention of specializing in environmental law and corporate accountability. "If people like Mom and Dad can manipulate the system for decades, we need people who know how to fight back in the same arena," she said. We moved into my grandmother's lake house together that fall, a quiet, sunlit refuge far removed from the glass and marble sterility of our childhood home. The lake house had always been the one place our mother disliked. I think she said that here, under my grandmother's watchful eye, we were allowed to be ourselves. In the evenings, we'd sit on the porch, mugs of tea in hand, talking about what came next. Sometimes it was logistical, upcoming court dates, media requests, or new developments in the FBI's case. Other times, it was more personal. "Do you think we'll ever stop being Harris daughters?" Mary asked once, watching the ripples on the lake. "We already have," I said after a moment. "We just haven't realized it yet. The name's theirs. What we do from here on out, that's ours." Breaking the cycle wasn't just about walking away from our parents. It was about rejecting the values they'd built their lives around, the obsession with control, the willingness to harm others for personal gain, the belief that appearances were more important than truth. It was about building something different in their place. For me, that meant channeling my anger into action, using the Harris knowledge base to undo the damage the Harris brand had inflicted. For Mary, it meant reframing her skills and experience, no longer as tools for our parents' empire, but as weapons against corruption. We knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The legal process was still unfolding. Our parents' trial was months away. The media attention hadn't fully died down, and there would always be people willing to believe their version of events. But for the first time, the two of us were on the same side of the line. Not as perfect and problem child, but as survivors who had chosen each other over the people who had raised us. And that choice, more than anything else, was how we'd finally broken free. 7 months after the rooftop terrace and the poisoned champagne, the case against our parents had reached a point of no return. The FBI had uncovered enough evidence to bury them under a mountain of criminal charges: attempted murder, environmental crimes, fraud, falsification of clinical trial data, obstruction of justice. It was clear they weren't going to win at trial. But Joseph and Eleanor Harris had never been gamblers. They preferred calculated moves, and the plea deal they accepted was exactly that. The call came early on a cold January morning. Our attorney, Vivian, sounded almost cautious, as if she didn't want to speak the words too loudly. They're accepting the offer. 20 years for your father on the attempted murder and environmental charges. 15 for your mother if she testifies about the corporate fraud. Sentencing is this afternoon. Mary and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The lake outside dusted in snow. She stirred her coffee slowly. "Do you want to go?" "Yes," I said, without hesitation. "I need to see it end." The courthouse felt different that day, not buzzing with reporters like at the preliminary hearing, but heavier somehow, like the building itself understood what was about to happen. Our parents were brought in wearing muted business attire, still managing to look composed despite months in detention, but they seemed smaller, as if some of their commanding presence had finally bled away. My mother's eyes flicked toward Mary and me briefly. My father kept his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the distance. The judge reviewed the terms of the deal and then gave them a chance to speak. My mother declined, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. My father stood, buttoning his jacket. For a moment, I thought he might say something that resembled remorse, an acknowledgement, however shallow, of the damage he'd caused. But instead, he launched into a speech about his lifetime of contributions to medical science and how he had always done what was necessary to protect the family business. He painted himself as a victim of changing regulations and political overreach, never once mentioning the people poisoned by contaminated water, the patients harmed by falsified data, or the daughter he had tried to incapacitate for money. In his mind, he was still justified. When the sentences were pronounced, my mother covered her face and wept openly. My father simply straightened his jacket, nodded once, and let the bailiff lead him away. I thought I might feel triumph in that moment, but what I felt instead was relief. A deep, quiet exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding since the day of my graduation party. Outside the courthouse, only a small group of reporters remained. Taylor and Zoe were waiting with Dr. Lewis, their faces breaking into relieved smiles when they saw us. Taylor hugged me tightly. "How are you feeling?" "Free," I said simply, "like I can finally breathe." In the months that followed, Mary and I began the slow process of moving forward. We sold most of our parents' personal assets, directing the proceeds toward a victim compensation fund for the communities impacted by Harris Pharmaceuticals' actions. The cleanup at the West facility began in earnest, and I was on site regularly, overseeing the remediation process. Mary threw herself into her first semester of law school, already talking about internships with environmental advocacy groups. We kept the lake house as our shared home, a place where we could return between work and studies, a refuge untouched by the weight of our family's past. Sometimes we would sit on the dock at night, looking out over the water, talking about what forgiveness meant and whether it was even possible. "Do you think you'll ever forgive them?" Mary asked one evening, the sun setting in streaks of orange and gold. "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word," I told her. "I've accepted what happened. I've let go of the anger because holding it was only hurting me. But forgiveness, that feels like it requires repentance. And I don't think they're capable of that." She nodded thoughtfully. I keep wondering if they were born this way or if something made them like this. And if so, what does that mean for us? It means we have choices, I said firmly. Their blood runs in our veins, but their values don't have to run in our hearts. The trial was over. The threat was gone. And for the first time in either of our lives, the future felt like ours to decide. A year to the day after the rooftop terrace and the champagne glass, I stood at a podium in a packed conference hall, presenting my research on pharmaceutical waste remediation. The irony wasn't lost on me, that the very knowledge my parents had feared I'd use against them had become my platform, my purpose, my way forward. From the stage, I spotted Mary in the audience, her phone held up to record. Beside her sat Taylor, Zoe, and Dr. Lewis, all smiling like they'd been waiting for this moment as much as I had. When the applause came, it wasn't just for the research. It felt like a closing of the loop, proof that I'd not only survived what my parents had done, but had refused to let it define me. Afterward, Mary and I walked back to the lake house, the cool spring air brushing against us. The house had become more than a safe haven. It was a symbol of everything we'd chosen for ourselves. We often talked about our grandmother here. Lillian had been the only person in our family who saw me, truly saw me, for who I was. She'd known I didn't fit into the Harris mold, and instead of trying to force me into it, she'd fortified me against it. Her trust fund wasn't just money. It was an escape hatch, a declaration that she believed I could break the cycle. Finding her old journal in my father's study had cemented that. The last entry, written in her neat, precise hand, still echoed in my mind. I have arranged for Mary's financial independence. She alone has the conscience and strength to break the cycle of this family's poison. She'd been right. Not because I was special, but because I'd made the choice she'd hoped I would. That, I realized, was the real inheritance. Not the money, not the house, but the freedom to choose who I wanted to be, no matter what my last name was. Mary had her own version of that freedom now. Law school was demanding, but she'd found a sense of purpose she'd never had while working for our parents. She was beginning to see that her value didn't come from compliance or approval, but from her ability to think, question, and act on her own terms. The bond between us had grown into something real, no longer forged by obligation or appearances, but by shared survival. We'd been raised to believe family loyalty meant protecting the family at all costs. Now we knew it meant protecting each other from harm, even if that harm came from within. In the quiet moments, I sometimes wondered what life might have been like if our parents had chosen differently, if they'd valued us more than their image, if they'd seen love as something other than a transaction. But those thoughts never lingered long. The truth was, their choices had made us who we were now, and I liked the people we were becoming. I poured much of my energy into the Environmental Foundation, expanding it to partner with other organizations tackling corporate pollution. We funded water testing in communities across the country, offered legal support to whistleblowers, and pushed for stricter environmental regulations. Every success felt like another step away from the Harris legacy and towards something I could be proud of. One evening, sitting on the dock with mugs of tea, Mary asked me a question I hadn't expected. Do you think we'd be here, like this, if none of it had happened? I thought about it. Probably not, I admitted. We'd still be living separate lives. You in the company, me on the outside. We'd still be playing the roles they assigned us. So, in a way, they gave us this, she said, gesturing to the lake, the house, the space between us that had been replaced by closeness. I nodded, not in the way they intended. But yeah, they pushed us far enough that we finally broke free. And once we did, there was no going back. The media had mostly moved on to fresher scandals by then, which suited us fine. The Harris name still carried weight in some circles, but for us, it was just a surname now, one we carried without obligation. When I think back to the rooftop terrace, to that glass of champagne and the decision I made in those seconds, I don't feel pride or shame anymore. I feel clarity. It was the moment everything came into focus, who they were, who I was, and what I was willing to do to survive. And survival, I've learned, isn't. to just about living through something. It's about deciding how you'll live after. If you'd told me a few years ago that my family's betrayal would lead me to this life, to a home I love, work that matters, and a bond with my sister I never thought possible, I would have laughed. But here we are. The most powerful antidote to poison isn't a chemical compound, it's truth. Truth about who you are, what you stand for, and what you refuse to tolerate, no matter who it's from. That's the inheritance my grandmother really left me, and it's the one I intend to protect for the rest of my life.